was a night that even the city lights couldn't warm. Rain poured like grief from heaven, and thunder rolled across the skyline. Inside his mansion, billionaire Alexander Raid sat alone before a dying fire, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his heart as empty as the glass he kept refilling. The world called him successful, but his home was silent, his heart haunted by the echo of a wife and child he'd lost years ago in an accident that money could never undo. Then, a knock, soft, hesitant, almost lost in the storm. He frowned. Nobody ever came to his door, not uninvited, but when he opened it he froze. There, drenched from the rain, stood a little girl no older than 7. Her dress was torn, her hair stuck to her cheeks, and she held a small stuffed rabbit pressed tightly to her chest. "Please, sir," she whispered, shivering, "I'm sorry to bother you, but my mama told me you help people. She said you're kind." Alexander felt something break inside him. Something he thought was long dead. That night would change everything. Alexander Raid hadn't smiled in years. His days were a routine of meetings, boardrooms, and signatures that made millions appear like magic. But all the wealth in the world couldn't fill the silence left by his family's absence. His mansion was a museum of memories. Cold marble floors, perfect paintings, and the ticking of a clock that seemed to mock the emptiness of his life. When he opened the door to the little girl that night, the first thing he noticed wasn't her soaked clothes. It was her eyes. They were the same shade of blue as his daughter's had been. "Where's your mother?" he asked, his voice trembling despite himself. "She's sick," the girl replied softly. "She told me to find you. She said you'd remember her." He frowned. "Remember her? What's her name?" The girl sniffled. "Her name's Clara." The glass slipped from Alexander's hand and shattered on the floor. Clara. He hadn't heard that name in nearly a decade. Clara had been a waitress at a small diner he used to visit in his early business days. A woman who once gave him coffee for free when he couldn't afford lunch. Who told him, "Money comes and goes, sir. Kindness doesn't." He'd promised to repay her someday. But he never did. Now, standing before him was her daughter, a fragile echo of a promise forgotten. He knelt down. "Where is she, sweetheart?" The little girl looked up, her lip quivering. In the alley behind the bakery, she couldn't walk anymore. Without another word, Alexander grabbed his coat and umbrella. The storm didn't matter. The rain didn't matter. The money in his bank didn't matter. When he found Clara, she was barely conscious, lying under a soaked blanket. She smiled faintly when she saw him. "You kept your promise," she whispered. "I told her you were kind." Tears blurred his vision. He carried her to his car, drove her to the hospital, and stayed by her side until dawn. But it was too late. Clara didn't make it through the night. As the sun rose, her daughter sat beside him, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "Is Mama sleeping?" she asked. Alexander swallowed the pain and wrapped his arms around her. "Yes," he whispered. "She's resting now." And for the first time in years, the billionaire wept, not for what he lost, but for what he'd found. Her name was Emma. After the funeral, Alexander couldn't bring himself to send her away. The system wanted to place her in foster care, but he saw too much of his own daughter in her smile. Against the advice of lawyers and advisors, he took her in. The mansion began to change. The long hallways filled with the sound of laughter. The dusty piano was played again. Emma's tiny footsteps echoed across marble floors that once only knew silence. But with her joy came memories. The ghosts of his past began to stir. The laughter of his wife, the small hands of his child. Every time Emma ran to hug him, his heart broke a little and healed a little more. One night, Emma found him sitting alone in his study, staring at a photo of his late family. "Do you miss them?" she asked softly. "Every day," he said. She thought for a moment, then climbed into his lap. "Mama said, when someone we love goes to heaven, they send us someone to help us smile again." Alexander's throat tightened. "And who did they send me?" She smiled brightly. "Me." He couldn't stop the tears that followed. From that night onward, Emma became his world. He enrolled her in the best school, read bedtime stories, even learned how to braid her hair. Badly, but she always laughed. The billionaire who once counted profits now counted giggles, hugs, and drawings taped to his office walls. But life, as always, had its way of testing love. One day, a letter arrived from a distant relative of Emma's mother. They wanted custody. claiming Alexander had no legal right. For the first time since she came into his life, he felt helpless again. The courtroom felt colder than any boardroom he'd ever sat in. Lawyers debated her future like a contract, but when Emma was asked where she wanted to live, she simply said, "With him. He's my family now." The judge paused, glanced at Alexander, and saw tears glistening in the billionaire's eyes. "Then with him you'll stay," the judge said softly. And just like that, Alexander learned the truest kind of wealth. The kind that can't be measured in dollars, but in love that refuses to let go. Years passed. Emma grew into a bright, compassionate young woman, one who never forgot where she came from. With Alexander's support, she started a foundation in her mother's name to help single mothers and children in need. At the opening ceremony, reporters asked Alexander how it felt to see this day. He smiled, his voice trembling. "Once, a woman gave me a cup of coffee when I had nothing. Her kindness built the man I became, and years later, her daughter knocked on my door and reminded me what it meant to be human again." As applause filled the room, Emma took his hand. "You gave me a home," she whispered. He looked at her with pride. "No," he said softly. "You gave me a reason to live." That night, back at the mansion, Alexander stood by the same door where it had all begun. The rain was falling again, gentle this time, like a blessing. He whispered into the storm, "Thank you, Clara, for sending her to me." A knock echoed behind him, playful this time. Emma's laughter followed. "Come on, Grandpa," she said, holding her little daughter's hand. "It's bedtime." Alexander turned, smiling through tears. The mansion was no longer silent. It was home. Moral of the story: one act of kindness can outlive lifetimes, because love once given always finds its way back home.